This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and hope for progress in the sector. With your host, Professor Judyth Sachs, former PVC Learning and Teaching at the University of Sydney, Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost at Macquarie University, and Special Advisor in Higher Education at KPMG, and now Chief Academic Officer at Studiosity. Welcome.
It gives me great pleasure today to talk to Professor Diana Laurillard, who has had an extraordinary career. But I'm going to let Diana introduce herself with a brief expose of how she got to be where she is. And currently she's Professor Emeritus at UCL. So, but you are still doing significant academic work. So can you just take us through the sort of the highlights of both your developmental life, but also your academic life?
Yes, well, it's a long story now. It begins back in the right at the end of the 70s when I left university with a degree in mathematics and philosophy, and had always thought I would go into something about mathematical philosophy. But then it was the 60s, and I'd been involved in student protests, and I'm thinking, what am I doing spending my life on philosophy? This is a little crazy. So I kind of lost heart with that almost immediately, and then just looked around randomly for jobs, something to pay my way in the world. And I was lucky to find a research assistantship at South Bank Poly, as it then was, Polytechnic, where they wanted a research assistant on the history of mathematics. And I thought, well, that's fine, I can manage that. But it also involved teaching mathematics. Now, then an interesting thing happened, because I'd never been very interested in teaching. I just didn't really think about it. But I discovered that so many students who'd passed all the exams to get onto a degree that required mathematics, like physics, engineering, and so on, didn't understand mathematics. And I was so shocked that after 13 years of schooling, they didn't understand mathematics. And that's what switched into a mission, essentially, to understand how learning works, to understand how teachers can help students learn. And then it kind of continued from there. And by the time that I was fairly quickly promoted to lecturer. And some of the kinds of techniques that I was trying out with my students had been taken on by other lecturers. And then becoming a lecturer then in a polytechnic meant that you had to be sent on a course to learn how to lecture. So I asked to be sent to a course at the University of Surrey, which was run by Professor Lewis Elton. I don't know if you remember that name, but Lewis was very prominent in championing educational technology at the time. So he ran the Institute of Educational Technology. So I was very fortunate to get, because of going on that course, I ended up getting a role on a whole new national development program on what was then called computer-assisted learning. And I'd been trying out things like, it was just the beginning of the Open University, which had a lot of programs, video programs, television programs on BBC 2 in those days. And I would record them off air and use the computer animations in my maths lectures. Students loved them. So that was what really took me into saying, this digital stuff can actually do something. So that National Development Program in Computer-Assisted Learning, what I was doing there was creating simulation programs of scientific ideas, where students could play with a model of a physical system to understand the physics better. So they were exploring it. It was like exploring a micro world. We didn't use that term in those days. So that was important. But then I began to realize that as more and more digital technologies were coming into education, people were just kind of scurrying after each new technology that came along without any kind of rationale or understanding what it could really do. And that's what took me into developing the idea of the conversational framework, and then going to the Open University to work which was ideal because it was an experimental place. Staff at the Open University loved experimenting with new ideas. So it was the perfect crucible for playing around with what digital technology could do. So my first book in 1993 on rethinking university teaching was really all about saying, look, we've got these wonderful technologies, but why should we be using them? And going back to the science of pedagogy and how students learn, to then create that framework which says, well, this describes what's going on for students in their relations with teachers and other students. But how do we augment those? How do we make sure that students are actually doing the conceptual thinking and practical application of those ideas? So that's where that idea was grounded. And then I was fortunate to get a role being the first Pro-Vice Chancellor of Technology for Learning and Teaching, which was at the OU. Spent 7 years doing that, created, I think it was the first institutional digital strategy for teaching, for improving student learning. And that led to then a role at the Department for Education and Skills under the Labour government in 2002, which was getting interested in using technology in education. And they wanted to develop an e-learning strategy. So I went there to develop what I think was the first cross-sector e-learning strategies. Now, by this time, quite a lot of countries were developing e-learning strategies primarily for schools or primarily for universities. But this was about cross-sector. You know, basically, we've all got to do the same kind of thing. We've got to make sure we've got the infrastructure in place. We've got to understand what kinds of interactions students need, and we've got to develop teachers' capabilities. Now, of course, this was politics, and during those 3 years at the department, there were 4 different secretaries of state running that department. So, you know, you can't get anything done in a context like that. I mean, I left after 3 years thinking, this is no way to run a government. This is ridiculous. You know, you can't get anything done that lasts for any length of time. So after that, I was fortunate to go back to academe, couldn't wait to get back into a rational environment, really. And the Institute for Education had just set up the Knowledge Lab, run by Richard Noss, who did a lot of mathematics education, and I'd known that sort of work for a long time. So went there to take forward the work on learning with digital technology, which I'd been trying to make a national project at the DFES, but now go back into that from a research perspective. And then when the Institute joined UCL, that was a wonderful opportunity then to take forward this much more multidisciplinary approach across a whole range of subject areas. So I've been very lucky, I think, with the places that I've been able to work, especially the Open University and the experience of government, and then the Institute of Education and UCL. They've all been places which have been able to nurture some of that program to fulfill that mission. Of course, my mission is not fulfilled. There's an immense amount to do, but that's kind of the main parts of the story.
So let's just go back a bit to your own experience as an undergraduate and a postgraduate in a time that was probably not technologically enhanced. It was much more didactic in the teaching, content-based. What do you remember from being a student, both as an undergraduate and a postgraduate?
Well, I was a student at Sussex, which was a new university and quite small. And when I arrived in 1966, we were the largest first year. It had suddenly expanded from taking a few hundred each year to taking 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
So my memory of the use of technology in education was that we had huge numbers of people in lectures and had overflow rooms where there was CCTV, where you could go and watch the lecture from another room.
So a personalized experience.
Worst possible use, really. So what I remember from that time, most of all, was that doing this mixed degree of mathematics and philosophy was that mathematics was a field in which You had to just knuckle down and know what there was to know and reproduce it. Philosophy was a field in which you could think your own thoughts. And this was intoxicating. And in Sussex, the maths department was in the science block and the philosophy department was in the arts and humanities block. So there was this huge partition of cultures. And what Sussex was known for was for bringing these two cultures together. It was an arts science university, and that's why it had this kind of course. But there were 12 of us on that course, and there were 300 mathematicians. So it was not that, no, science and maths generally, and engineering. But it was the philosophy and the way you could think about knowledge and have your own ideas, discuss, debate, and there was none of that in maths. There's no reason why there shouldn't be. And when I was teaching maths, when I came to teach maths, I tried to bring in more social learning as part of the way in which my students were using maths, and also focus on the idea of mathematics as problem solving. So I took that sort of excitement I had about problem solving into a situation when I was teaching, when I had a group of students who had no idea about maths. All they could do in faced with a maths problem was say, well, I think these numbers look as though they could go into this kind of equation. Let's see how that works. It was their problem-solving approach. So I spent a few weeks teaching them about problem solving. I don't know if you remember Pollier's work, George Pollier's work on problem solving. He wrote a book about problem solving, thinking about the end game and how you're going to try and get there and the steps you need to go from where you are and what you've got to where you need to get to. So we did about, and also some kind of puzzles and things like that I did to make them think and believe that they could take a kind of responsible approach to problem solving. And then ironically, what happened with that group was that they ended up, because I'd concertinaed the amount of time for covering the curriculum, I then took them through the rest of the curriculum in terms of all the kinds of exam questions they had to answer in the exam. Now, this was a national exam, so it was validated that way. And they always asked the same questions every year. So there was a very clear pattern, and it was not hard to help them understand the mathematics through just going through each of these questions. And that group, they shifted their exam scores by 20%. So nobody failed. The usual bell curve, you know, that normal curve you get, instead of centering on about 45, shot up to 75. Everybody passed, lots of people did well. But the exam board, which was a public exam board, was furious because it was not supposed to work like this. And the chair of the examiners said, these students are being coached for this exam. Now, I was about 23 at the time and trying to stand up to all these middle-aged men. And I said, but that's my job. And I went through, you know, what I'd done with them. And they were still furious. And they insisted that they would shift the bell curve back down to its normal place. And the only point that I won was that nobody would fail as a result. But those students had learned some maths. And they learned it through that sense of agency that you get from believing that you can solve a problem, not just work to some protocol that somebody's given you. And those things are so fundamental to teaching and learning. So I got a bit off topic there, but there was a bit, you know, the origins of that kind of approach were in my university education, I think.
So I first learned about you in reading your book, Rethinking Teaching in Higher Education. And that really was a watershed work. You had a profound impact on, one, making teaching the centerpiece of what happens in university, but then providing a number of alternatives and lenses and interpretations of what it means to teach and what good teaching constitutes. If you were, this series is called Reimagining the Future of Higher Education. If you were going to write a book with the same sort of project that you've had throughout your life, What would a book on reimagining the future of higher education look like for you? Not that I'm putting you on the spot.
Well, and I mean, that's not an unfamiliar question, in the sense that, in a way, that's what the most recent book that I did with a colleague, Eileen Kennedy, whom I've worked with for nearly 10 years. I mean, we've done a lot of research together. And that's, in a way, what that book is trying to do. It's called Online Learning Futures.
Mhm.
And so essentially what we've been doing and thinking about that is thinking, where could this go now? What's fundamental to this? And I think if I can sort of skip to what that's meant to be about, it is about focusing on the teachers, which is just the point you made about the first book. Teachers hadn't had many books written about them before, and they still don't have many. And they still don't even have technologies which have been developed for them. They've got virtual learning environments, doesn't go much beyond that, really. And that's not about teaching, it's about organization and management of teaching, if anything, really. So the message of this new book is much more on trust the teachers. They know what they're doing. They're passionate about their students. They really want to help their students, but they do need some support. So giving them the tools and the means to build up digital pedagogic knowledge, which we all now need. So as we get more and more and rapid development of technologies which are coming into education, whether we like it or not, teachers have to be in control of that, and we're not in control. The teaching profession is not in control of that at all. So what I reimagine for the future is that what we've got to do is to become professionals in the way in which we build the use of digital technology in education. And that means a collaborative project. And that means making teaching much more like research, where as professionals, we build on what other people have done. We know what other teachers have done in this area. And we take some particular area for ourselves and we develop that, and then we share it back with the rest of the community. It's not the way that teaching has ever worked. So I'm not confident that this will happen, but I don't see why we shouldn't imagine it and create the tools and the systems for doing that. And that's what I think we're now trying to do.
Given that there is a saying that teaching is a very private act, and there's only one other thing that's more private than teaching, and that's in the bedroom. But in fact, that's no longer private either. But how can you sort of open the door so that people embrace the sort of the public benefit of seeing how other people teach and learning from others?
Well, it's a very good question. We have tried it, and I think that's essentially what we're trying to do with the way we develop the use of professional courses on MOOC platforms, because that is essentially an opportunity for, we're trying to sort of emulate what happens in the research world, in a sense. So a course for teachers, which is a professional development course in a sense, gives them some aspects of the latest research, so they've got something to think with. But primarily, it's about enabling them to think about how they would use these ideas in their own research, and the Learning Designer tool, which is an online development tool for teachers to experiment with teaching ideas. And you can do that on your own, but you can also share your idea with other people, and you can also look at what other people's ideas have been. So part of the Learning Designer as a tool is a library of other people's designs, which they said, well, this worked for me and let me share it with you. And those are kind of categorized. So that's kind of emulating the research journal. Now, teachers are never going to write papers in research journals. They just don't have the time. They don't even want to. It's not what they do. And even if you are a scientist, you don't want to have to do that as part of your teaching as well. So forget the idea of teachers having their own scientific journal. That's not going to work. But with the thinking they do around how can I make this concept more intelligible to students, and thinking about what you do in the lecture, what you ask them to do after the lecture, the way you prepare them for the next lecture, what kind of assignments you set, and so on. All of that is teaching design for learning. And you come up with some good ideas, and teachers have many very good ideas, but they should be shareable. So that's what you can do with a learning designer. It might take you half an hour to represent that design thinking about teaching and learning in this tool, which can then give that as a kind of starter kit to other people. So it's a little like then reading that research paper. It says, okay, yes, I get that. Let me see what I can do with that. Take it into your own research, experiment, do something, find out something, and give that back to the community again. Now that churn of iterative knowledge development and representation and sharing and experimenting is what I'd love to see in teaching. And that's what opens your eyes to the value of being able to go beyond what just I do, but also the satisfaction of finding that other people like what you do and are prepared to build on it and take it on, copy it. And it can go from physics to English literature. You know, the same when you're designing a teaching program, and from the point of view of what students have to do, most of what you're writing down as what goes on is pedagogic. Not much of it is necessarily content. The content is all in the reading and the watching the videos or the reading papers or listening to a lecture or whatever. That's where the content is. But the pedagogy is in all the things you try to get people to do with that content. So that's why it can travel from one subject to another. It's fascinating.
If you put learning in the middle of that treatise that you just were talking about, how would the focus on learning modify some of those points? Or is learning implicit, so in fact you don't even have to talk about it because it's actually just the business?
Well, no, it's not implicit at all. It has to be explicit. That's really the point. And the point of the learning designer tool was to take the conversational framework into action. So if you're saying to people, what students need to do is not just listen and read and watch videos or demonstrations or whatever. They've got to do something with that stuff. So of the 6 learning types of learning, which the conversational framework developed and introduced in the later book, only learning through acquisition is relatively passive, where the student can just take it in. And you can take it in, you can read all the stuff, you think, yeah, I understand all that. But actually you don't. And you don't find that out until you have to do something with it. So learning through inquiry, learning through practice, learning through discussion, learning through collaboration, learning through production or assignments, all those 5 are social, active forms of learning. And that's when you find out you don't understand it quite as well as you thought you did. And you've got to work at it a bit. So the point of the learning designer tool is to say, okay, map out what you want students to do in order to understand this complex idea. So you begin by getting them to think about their current understanding of that idea, maybe. Have a discussion about it or write something about it if they're not in class. And then you take them into telling them about a problem that you can now solve with this idea, which you wouldn't have been able to solve with your initial understanding. So that gives you a reason for knowing about this.
Mm-hmm.
And then you take them into a series of activities to use that idea in order to solve this problem, that problem, or discuss what you might do, or design something that would work. I mean, all the things which, I mean, these are not new things for people to do, but it's just thinking about what it takes for the student to get that idea and to really understand it and all its applications. So you're thinking the description of the pedagogy is all in terms of what the student is doing. Now, I remember when I first introduced the learning designer to people, teachers would sometimes say, but where am I in this?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's all about, what the student is doing. And the teacher is there because some of it is about follow what the teacher is saying in the video. Then think about your own experience of this and do this and this and this and so on. So the teacher is there in saying to the student, read what the teacher has set you to read, listen to the lecture, watch the demo. That's where the teacher is. And the teacher otherwise is implicit in this whole process in the sense that they are the ones who's designed what you as the student have to do. And of course, the teacher will come in as a discussant, or will follow up with another, will give them feedback on what they've done. So another thing that you could build into your lectures, for example, which a lot of lecturers do, is to use a quiz, which is meant to test whether they really understood the first half hour of the lecture. Turns out quite a lot of them get the quiz wrong. So that's an opportunity for the lecturer to explain why you might have got that one wrong. You know, that question was in there as a distractor precisely because it's easy to confuse X with Y or whatever. So it's just thinking about what's going to make the student think. And that's what the teacher has to do.
Given the sort of technology-rich environment that students are now operating within, and they really want immediacy.
Yeah.
And they want immediate feedback. They want to find information immediately, and they want to complete a transaction immediately.
Yes.
This seems to be counter to the sort of the reflective practice that we want to create in universities, the sorts of skills that you were talking about. How do you manage the complexity of students now with the framework that you've just described?
Well, I think it plays into that because, I mean, you mentioned the importance of reflection, and that's true. You've got to reflect. But reflect is not one of the learning types. And that's because I think I discovered this at the OU when I was interviewing students about how they work through Open University learning materials. And I would ask them at various points in the text, it was all very well-written text, and every so often it would say something like, reflect on your own experience of this and think about how you would change things or something. And I would ask students about how they dealt with that question. And they would say, yes, I'd read it and I'd think a bit, but then I'd move on. And I said, well, did you spend any time? Did you write down what they suggest you write down? No. I felt guilty about it, but I'd always. And that kind of, please now reflect, is not a good learning instruction. You've got to get the student to do something in order to reflect. What are they going to do is the question. And in the doing, they will have to reflect. And that's your job as a teacher. You've got to create the means for them to reflect. So that's what you have to do in that learning design. Now, as you say, immediacy is very important. And you reflect on immediate feedback. And it doesn't matter how hard the teacher works on giving feedback on an essay that comes 3 weeks after the student wrote it. They won't read it. They're not bothered with it. We know that. And yet we still work that way. They do want immediacy. That's when you want to know, oh, yes, I see what I did wrong. So the digital world can do that for them in different ways. To some degree, you can have things like peer review, which gives you, the students are working in pairs or threes or something, and they review each other's work, and that makes you think. You can do it by having some kind of digital tool that gives you something when you put it in, and it gives you something back, and that will work in certain areas where you've got those kinds of digital tools available to you. So if you're working in science or business or anything like that, using an Excel spreadsheet to try things out and try to make something come out a particular way, trying to make a climate change model increase all these parameters by only, 2 degrees or something or less. And it's really hard work to make that model work, or a business model a similar way. That makes you reflect. Now, one of the things I think might be behind your question is what's going on in AI at the moment. And the way that clever question, that chatbots are working, because you say, okay, how am I going to write this essay? Please write it for me. And it does. You've got some immediate feedback there. Or you can use it to say, here's my version of how the introduction should go. What do you think? And the chatbot can give you some reflective feedback, and it's immediate. So that is an extraordinarily valuable tool in the right hands, as long as the teacher doesn't encourage it to do. I mean, if the AI world had asked us, what do you really want from us? We would not have said a tool that allows students to write bad essays with a lot of mistakes in them. That's not what we would have asked for. So we've got to counter this huge temptation with some very good pedagogy around what those tools can do, and enable the students to use them in a way that makes them reflect. So it's going to be by doing things like comparing their structure for an essay with what the tool did, and allowing that the tool won't be as good as them, or might give them some ideas. So treating the tool something like a chatbot as a kind of peer, not necessarily a student peer, and using that as a way to get you to rethink what you've just done or what you may be thinking about, I think is absolutely fine. And that's what we should be trying to do with digital tools, is to help us get students thinking by the way in which they use those tools.
Yeah, and to actually have the frameworks to critique the tools and see what the strengths are and the weaknesses are, and how they can integrate the use of these tools into their own approach to learning.
Yes. Yeah, so the teacher has got to ask themselves all the time, how is this tool going to make my students think harder? Because as you say, reflection is absolutely critical to understanding difficult ideas, or to developing your own ideas about how the world should be and so on. I mean, it's critical to academic thinking. You've got to reflect, but you've got to be made to reflect.
And it's not solipsistic. It's not navel gazing. It's actually got to be purposeful.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's mind expanding is what it should be. And it takes some exciting place, and you think, yes, I can get this and I can go beyond it. And that's what we want students in university courses to be thinking about, is not just getting the ideas which, you know, you're building on all the knowledge that's gone in the past, but it's what you as an individual can now do with that that's critical and exciting and powerful for them. So they've got to have that sense of agency. And there's so much in digital tools and the way we could use them that does give students a sense of agency. All the tools that we use as teachers, I mean, even something like creating a PowerPoint animation or a website or something, well, the students can do that to represent what they know. So in the learning type, learning through production, you learn a lot by trying to create a video animation of some process or system or something, or trying to create a translation. Now, Google Translate, wonderful for learning languages, but don't just let the tool do it all for you. Use the tool to teach yourself.
So that's actually the point, isn't it? Use the tool to help, not use the tool to do the work.
Exactly. Use the tool to develop your mind. That's what it's about. And don't let it steal it away from you.
But what I'm also hearing is, and observing in my consultancy work in universities, is sadly there's a lack of curiosity amongst many of our students. They've got for many of them, going to university is a means to an end so that they can go and earn money. For some of them, they lack that curiosity. It's just in time getting stuff done. But it's also sort of a risk aversity. They're not willing to make mistakes, because if they make mistakes, they'll fail. So how do you create a different sort of mindset so that in fact the tools that you're talking about are enablers of that, and build on that, and reset how students navigate the world?
Well, what do they enjoy? They do enjoy digital interaction. I mean, this is a generation that usually enjoys that. They enjoy games and things like that. And it is possible to create that kind of fascination with what you can do with your own agency. And if we could turn education not into something which you're given and you've got to just get somehow and tick these boxes and then you'll be into a good job or something, but it's much more like winning at a game and figuring out what it takes to get that goblet or whatever it is you're after. I don't use video games at all, so I won't be able to use these analogies very well. But what is it that drives you in a game? It's getting that goal. So setting up the tasks for students to do in what we design for them to do either in class or beyond class is about trying to achieve some goal. So make it a bit more like game playing, in which your agency within that game then gives you a competence or a skill or a way of thinking that you didn't have before. There should be some excitement to it.
Mm-hmm.
And the most important thing in your life is to get a job that you love and that's challenging and that engages your thinking. And you won't get that by ticking boxes. It just doesn't happen. So you've got to find that. And I think our university courses have got to give students the chance to discover those things that do excite them, to find ways of doing that. So it's not about giving them the knowledge, and that kind of transmission model of teaching and learning is wrong, because they won't get that sense of agency or curiosity or power. So before you introduce a difficult concept, give them a difficult task to solve, which they won't be able to because they haven't got that concept yet. There's a very good paper by Dan Schwartz called A Time for Telling. Dan Schwartz from Stanford, I think he was when he did this. And it was about a concept in psychology, and he gave students a problem about solving some kind of doctor-patient diagnosis problem, I think it was, something like that. So long ago since I've read it. And then he had two groups, and he gave one group a text to read about that problem, that issue, and the other group just the problem to try and solve. Then he gave them the lecture, and after the lecture, he gave both groups a multiple choice test and also a test of how would you solve this problem X, which was based on the same thing. Both groups did well in the multiple choice test, but only the group that had had the problem to solve at the start did anything at all with that more challenging question at the end of the lecture. And that's because they were ready to listen to, they wanted to hear the lecture. They wanted to know the answer to this problem. They've been struggling with it. The other group just said, oh, yeah, I understand all that. Didn't listen to the lecture in the same way. So that phrase, a time for telling, we don't have to tell this stuff to people. I mean, we've got to pass on the knowledge that everyone's developed in the last several millennia. So we've got to pass it on. There is a time for telling, but they've got to be ready for the telling. They've got to think, so how on earth do you solve that? Give them that problem, and then the lecture becomes something they're waiting for, they're hungry for. So that kind of way of thinking, it's almost like a sort of inversion of the way we think about teaching and learning. It's not giving them all the stuff, it's getting them to solve what they can't yet solve, or something like that, create the curiosity.
I just want to reframe our discussion a little bit, is that some of your critics, and in the academy, everybody criticizes each other's work. Some critics argue that while Laurrillard's frameworks are theoretically sound, they can be challenging to implement in practice, especially in traditional education settings that may resist change. And we know that there's a real inherent conservatism amongst some of our academic peers to change. So how do you actually respond to that resisting change and to create that sense of inquiry that you were just talking about in that, the time to listen?
Among the teachers. You mean creating that sense of inquiry among the teachers? Well, it makes teaching much more interesting for a start. I mean, if you've got your body of knowledge and you're giving that over and over again to your students, there's nothing very interesting about that. So changing that approach, if that's what they mean by the traditional approach, I think just would be great for them. But I also think that implementation of those learning types is not difficult at all. It's what they've always been doing. I mean, they're not bizarre ideas. They come from the history of research on pedagogy and student learning. And every single one of those learning types has its origins in conventional technologies or conventional methods. So learning through inquiry, we've always sent students off to the library to find out things for themselves, to write an essay. Learning through practice, they go to the lab or they do other kinds of exercises. They critique a poem or they write a chapter or something. Learning through discussion, we always have discussion groups, we have question and answer groups and so on. We have seminars and whatnot. With learning through collaboration, well, that's what research is all about. And we try to set up some of those kinds of things for our students with project work and that sort of thing sometimes. And learning through production is just, it's assignments, it's setting assignments. That's how you represent what you've learned. So we do all those things anyway. And the point of the conversational framework is to think about this from the point of view, what does the student have to do to get those continual cycles of reconceptualization moving and linking with the cycles of practice and what it takes to put those things into action. So that's what the conversational framework is really representing. It's not new. It's just that it's trying to emphasize and highlight what the nature of the teacher role is not to deliver information and ideas, is to make students' minds work. So there are all these different ways of doing it, both conventional and now digital. Huge array of digital toys to play with in this toy box. Why not get interested? It's fascinating. It's fun. It's creative.
So what do you think student learning will be like within the next 5 to 10 years? What will the student experience be like?
Well, mostly I worry about it because I don't think that universities in general or governments are really approaching what's possible in a way that will improve things very much. And the things that are most likely to win are the kinds of things that especially the corporate tech lobby will create for education, because they think they know about education because they've been through it and they've learned stuff. But they don't know a thing about teaching and learning. And most of the AI stuff I've seen, which is supposedly adaptive to the individual, is adaptive in the sense that it finds out what that individual can't do, and then it gives them more of that stuff they just didn't manage to learn in order to do that. I mean, essentially, it's that kind of, will repair what's absent. Nothing about excitement or curiosity or agency or experimentation. And nothing, to go back to your other question, about getting things wrong. It's good to get things wrong. That's how you learn. And what you can do with digital tools is find out that actually you didn't manage to get climate change down to within 2 degrees. Your model went up to 5, an increase of 5 degrees. So you've got to go back and look at it again. And you've got the agency nobody has to tell you that. Nobody has to tell you you were wrong about that. You can see it in the model. Nobody has to tell you how to go back. You've just made those manipulations. Go back and do different manipulations and see what happens. So using the digital technology to work for what education needs, rather than what the tech companies happen to want to give us, which is rubbish like ChatGPT, then we'd be much better off. But the teaching community has very little agency in this. And universities as institutions are mainly worrying about how we worry about ethics and privacy and stealing things, plagiarism and all those sorts of things, which is right, they've got to worry about those, but worry more about what your students' minds are doing, because they're being corrupted by the way in which modern technology works. Social media is, generally speaking, a disaster for good education. If you can get your students on a WhatsApp group that's trying to figure out the best way to do X, Y, or Z, fine. But that's not what's happening, is it?
No.
So I worry that, we're not using the digital world well, and the digital world thinks it can solve education for us, and that's very dangerous. So I'm afraid I'm largely pessimistic about what's going to happen for students over the next 10 years.
So just to finish, What advice would you give a group of first-year students if you were teaching them? What advice would you give them about how to have the agency that you talk about, how to create this curiosity?
Well, I would like to see students actually giving voice to their own critique of what they're getting. And to some extent they do. The pandemic was interesting because it forced everyone onto online learning. And a lot of people learned something about what you can do in a positive way, which was great. I was furious because I'd spent, decades trying to persuade the world of how valuable digital learning is. A global pandemic did it overnight. People suddenly realized, oh, we can do something with this. On the other hand, you might say, well, it's so hard to convince people that's what it would take, something of that magnitude. You can't just talk about this stuff and expect to get through. So anyway, they did. And coming out of it, then students realized that they want not just online and not just on campus, but they do want a mix of the two. So making sure that we're listening to students and we're giving them the opportunity to express these ideas. And even within their own course, they could be pushing academics to do things differently with them. And this was what was very good about the OU, actually, was that when I was trying to push the idea of digital technology there, in council, there were three student union representatives, and they were so valuable because all the other people around the table couldn't argue against this when they were in favor of all this online technology and digital tools and everything. So nobody could say, oh, well, I think it's better for the students not to have them at all, and it's going to change the relationship between tutor and student, when the students are saying, no, this is great, we need it. So students are very good advocates for what needs to happen, but not always, because sometimes they'll just want more lectures because they think that's easier, and that's not what they need. They need more help in understanding how to use lectures and so on, but not more.
Look, I'd just like to finish by recognizing and acknowledging your enormous contribution to higher education teaching. You have been one of the voices that people have listened to, have sought advice from, and you have made a difference to both the theory and practice of teaching in higher education. So from me, as somebody who's known of your work and met you a couple of times many years ago, you have been remarkable. And the fact that you have 25,420 citations indicates that I'm not just the only person.
That's so generous, Judyth. That's so kind of you. Thank you. And when I wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning thinking, oh, what am I going to do? How am I going to change things? I'll reflect on that, and it'll make me a little happier. Thank you.
But one last thing that's totally irrelevant to our discussion. What are you reading at the moment?
I'm reading Silk Roads. We've got this wonderful exhibition at the British Museum. It's a book.
Yeah.
About the trades across the Silk Roads. And we went to the exhibition last week, and it was so crowded, it was very hard to see anything very much, and you just sort of select bits and pieces here and there. And there wasn't enough information. There were no maps of, all these different routes. You couldn't sort of orient yourself somehow. So the only way to deal with that exhibition is to go away and read the most scholarly book about the Silk Roads, which we've now got. So my husband and I are both reading this book now so we can go back before it closes in February and understand the exhibition better.
And in fact, the nature of your approach to teaching, understanding.
Yes, a very good point. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time today, and it's been a real pleasure for me. I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as I have.
Very much. Great questions. Thank you very much, Judyth.
You have been listening to Studiosity's podcast, Reimagining Higher Education, candid conversations within higher education, sharing stories of leadership, change, and best practice in teaching and learning. Visit studiosity.com.